said that it wasn't until that point in time that scientists were thinking about the impact of their work. And so it's almost comical now to me, the person that told me that, to think like, well, no, wait a second. When they were writing Jekyll and Hyde, there was controversy over science.
Oh, yeah. I mean, scientists have been thinking about the impact of their work, I would guess probably since science has been done, right? Because you always think about what are the implications for society. And scientists were debating this heatedly at the end of the 19th century and saying, well, is it good that we're the sum of our neurochemical impulses, or is it a bad thing, you know? And this was really scary for people.
And where else did this play out in literature then?
You see it a lot in like H.G. Wells and his novels about alien brains and extraterrestrial intelligence. And then Dracula, my argument is that he's a mad scientist in a way, even though he's also a vampire, because he experiments on people. He does these things. He, you know, tests their minds in certain ways. And
you know what? I mean, I'm really embarrassed of this now. I've never read Dracula. I only know of like the movie takes on it. And in fact, I was thinking Dracula is some sort of ancient myth that we have, not a book that was written in the 19th century.
I think there was sort of an ancient myth that it was supposedly based upon that I don't know that much about. But yeah, Dracula was very much a 19th century story, and most people only know it from the films. They don't know it from like, you know, the actual novels. Same with Frankenstein or Jekyll and Hyde.
This is exactly right. So can you give an overview of Dracula?
Yeah, well, so Dracula is obviously about a vampire who comes from Transylvania, you know, and he lives in his castle. And it starts out where a solicitor, a lawyer, comes from England to help him. I don't know what he's trying to do, sell his castle, or no, he's trying to find a residence in England. That's what it is. So Jonathan Harker, the lawyer, comes there to help Dracula find a residence in England. Meanwhile, Dracula is like biting him and planning to kill him, and, you know, all these weird things happen. Jonathan escapes and gets back to England and tells his friends there, oh my gosh, there's this sinister vampire who's trying to buy a house in England. We have to stop him. So his friends get together. He has a doctor friend. Anyway, there's a lot of these people. And Dracula, meanwhile, makes his way to England via ship. He changes himself into an animal, into a dog, because he can do that. And he goes on board ship, and then he, you know, jumps off when there's a shipwreck. And there he is in England, and he starts preying on Jonathan's friends and biting them and turning them kind of into automatons because they become his unconscious minions who just follow him around. And so, long story short, a lot of crazy things happen, but in the end, Dracula is vanquished when they drive a stake through his heart in his home castle of Transylvania. And two doctors are involved in this vampire fighting process, and a lawyer and a lot of professional men, you know, and an American. I don't know why. So that's the story in a nutshell.
And what do you think was the author's intent?
I think Bram Stoker was really interested in psychical research, which had to do with the study of haunted houses and spirits and whether these things were real. I think he was essentially a Christian who was kind of anti-science in a way, but he also had a really strong scientific training because 3 of his brothers were physicians. 3 of his brothers were doctors. 1 was a brain surgeon, which is really interesting. And he was really close with the one who was a brain surgeon. So they talked about brain surgery on occasion. So he knew about these neurological experiments, and he was kind of frightened by the implications. And I think Dracula was how he worked out his fear of, what does it mean that we're the sum of our neurochemical impulses, or that we can experiment on animals without, you know, feeling bad about it necessarily, you know? I think he was trying to work through all those things.
And did he write other books that were in the same genre?
Yeah, he wrote this book called The Jewel of the Seven Stars, which I have to admit I haven't read. I'm kind of embarrassed about that. And then also In the Lair of the White Worm, which is really weird, like weirdest thing you'll ever read. And it's about a woman who turns into a giant worm and lives in this tunnel underground, and it's just bizarre.
And so help me understand, when you're working with these students, what is it that you hope they pull out of Dracula?
I hope they enjoy it. I hope they find it a fun read because I want them to enjoy literature. And I also want them to see all the various different ways you could interpret it. Because Dracula is one of those fun texts that you can interpret a lot of ways, right? There's like tons of sexual metaphors, and they tend to like that because it's interesting, you know? And
in high school, they weren't allowed to talk about
they
it.
Exactly. They weren't allowed to talk about it in high school. So you can talk about it on that level.
You know, the Canterbury Tales was banned at my high school because there was sexual innuendo in that some of the other students didn't like, and so it was banned at my high school.
Well, that's a shame. Those are the fun parts.
Well, it kind of put us on the map, right? Then it made every high school student want to read it because you're like, wait a second, what's it banned for?
Yeah, I mean, there is kind of interesting sexual stuff in there now that I think about it. But did you guys actually learn Middle English to read it? Or I guess not, because you weren't allowed to read it.
Yeah, well, I think by the time I got to high school, they were allowed to read certain parts of it, but there were other parts of it that were banned. I don't remember it being a pleasant experience. I remember like the baker, the candlestick. Yeah, I don't remember it. Yeah,
so you probably weren't allowed to read like The Wife of Bath's Tale, or
I think that's the part that got it banned.
Yeah, that's too bad.
And but my point was, when you're in high school and then go to college, and all of a sudden you can talk about not just you can actually openly talk about sex and those topics in your class.
Yeah, but it's really hard with these Catholic students. Like, some of them aren't Catholic, so I don't want to say, you know, they all are, but a lot of them have been to Catholic schools, no matter what their background, so they're uncomfortable talking about sex.
Because St. Louis University is a Catholic school, isn't it?
Yeah, so I should have clarified that. Yeah. And at other schools where I've taught, the students are thrilled to talk about sex. They love it. But at SLU, I have to kind of draw them out, like, doesn't this sound like it might be a penis? You know, I have to go there because they just won't. You know,
you really can tell a difference between the Catholic kids and the Catholic school kids and the other schools.
Well, even the ones who weren't at Catholic schools, I think the Midwest people tend to be more reserved about stuff like that. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, this is it's my podcast, and I'm a little bit like, am I going to get in trouble for talking about this?
Yeah. Well, so anyway, for some reason, I can't get the students to talk about it very much, and I'm like, hey, this is the fun part. This is the part I personally looked forward to discussing when I was 18. You know, and I can't get them to necessarily engage because they're like too shy.
And what are the parts that they don't have trouble engaging with?
More on an intellectual level, I guess. Like, if you give them a task and you set them to do it, I'm trying to think. I think if you give them a really specific task that's a little less controversial, they tend to have less trouble with that. But yeah, sexual topics, I've found that most places it was a big hit, but like here it's a no-go. It just doesn't work very well.
I didn't have any idea that Dracula had any of that in it. I mean, this is
all the biting, you know, the penetration and the exchange of bodily fluids and stuff. So it's all metaphorical.
Was it pretty controversial at the time the book was written?
I think somewhat, but it's weird how tone deaf people were to those metaphors before Freud. Like, I think that's one reason why people maybe didn't recognize some of these metaphors at the time, only later, you know?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You think Freud made people go back in their literature and be like, wait a second, I missed it. So just the concept of symbolic meaning around sex just didn't exist?
It's really hard to understand what was going on with the Victorians and why they didn't grasp these metaphors. Like, you would think it's so obvious, right? The biting, the penetration, the bodily fluids. But yeah, I think Freud made people more sensitive to this type of imagery. And even like really obvious phallic imagery, people didn't necessarily like notice it. So it's just, yeah, it's very strange that they didn't catch on. But we think Freud has something to do with that.
And then, and Freud would have been like 50s and 60s, 40s and 50s?
No, he would have been early 20th century.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so not far after those books were written.
Not that long after. And some people say, you know, he's really a product of the Victorian era himself, in a sense, even though he was living in Austria. And so it's appropriate to use his work to think about the 19th century. But in the 19th century, people in England didn't really know about him yet.
Thanks for watching this podcast short. You can find the rest of the interview on my channel. If you like this video, I hope you'll hit the like button and consider subscribing. I release a new interview with an interesting person every Wednesday morning.